The tea party had been the kind that St. Mary Mead prided itself on, lace tablecloths fluttering gently in the garden breeze, fine china cups painted with tiny roses, and the subtle scent of freshly baked scones drifting from the vicar's wife's kitchen. It was meant to be an afternoon of gossip, charity donations, and gentle laughter, but the gathering ended in a silence so thick it seemed to strangle the air itself. Mrs. Dorothy Lytton, the formidable hostess with her reputation for flawless etiquette, had been found slumped in her wicker chair, her teacup shattered on the grass beside her. At first, some thought she had fainted from the heat, or perhaps a sudden weakness of the heart. But the doctor, summoned in great haste, declared with grave certainty that Mrs. Lytton had been poisoned. The announcement struck the assembled ladies and gentlemen like a hammer blow. Tea, which moments before had seemed so harmless, now appeared sinister, every sip a potential threat. The scene was peculiar from the very beginning. Each guest had poured their own tea from the same pot, sweetened it from the same sugar bowl, and added milk from the same small jug. There was no reason to believe that Mrs. Lytton's cup should have been singled out, and yet it had been. Even, stranger, on the grass beside her overturned chair lay a single small playing card, a 3 of hearts damp from the spilled tea, its edges curling. No one admitted to carrying playing cards, and certainly not to leaving one lying about at such a genteel gathering. It seemed a bizarre, almost mocking clue. The constable, red-faced and sweating in his heavy uniform, did his best to impose order. Guests were asked to remain while statements were taken, though whispers fluttered between them like restless sparrows. Who would wish to harm Mrs. Lytton? She was a stern woman, yes, with a sharp tongue and little patience for frivolity, but she was respected, even feared in certain circles. To poison her here in the open, before the eyes of neighbors and friends, seemed at once reckless and impossible. Miss Marple, seated quietly at the far end of the garden, observed with her usual mild detachment. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, though she had long since stopped moving her needles. She had seen the tea poured, had watched the hostess raise her cup, and had noticed, too, the flicker of expressions among those present. To the casual eye, nothing had been out of place. To Miss Marple, however, the crime already smelled not of mystery but of calculation. The guests were restless as they were questioned. The vicar's wife, pale and trembling, insisted that she had tasted the same tea and felt perfectly well. Mr. Harcourt, the banker with the heavy gold watch, loudly proclaimed the absurdity of the situation, though his bluster seemed a shade too forceful. Young Lucy Lytton, the victim's niece, wept openly, though her tears came and went in curiously neat intervals. And then there was Mrs. Violet Trent, a widow known for her elaborate hats and sharper-than-average wit, who sat back with narrowed eyes as if daring the constable to accuse her. The playing card, however, remained the oddest element. It had not come from the pack used for whist the night before, nor did anyone claim to recognize it. It could have been slipped into Mrs. Lytton's hand, her lap, or her saucer without much notice. But why? A taunt, a warning, or some private message meant only for the victim herself? The doctor's words hung in everyone's ears. Poison. Deliberate and swift. Yet where was the poison placed? In the sugar? No, for all had used it. In the milk? Impossible, as the jug had been shared. In the teapot? Again, everyone had drunk from it. That left only the cup itself, yet Miss Marple had seen Mrs. Lytton take it from the neat stack of china at the start, indistinguishable from the rest. Unless, of course, someone had seen to it that one cup had been prepared differently, waiting, like a trap for the unfortunate hand that chose it. As the constable fumbled with his notebook, Miss Marple's eyes softened in their familiar way, as though she were remembering some long-past incident from the village, the sort of small, human foolishness that often shed light on larger wickedness. She noted how Lucy avoided her aunt's body, as if unwilling to even glance in that direction. She marked how Mr. Harcourt dabbed his brow with a handkerchief, far too often for the mild warmth of the afternoon. And she noticed, most telling, of all, how Mrs. Trent adjusted her hat again and again, though it had not shifted once. It was clear enough that the crime had not been born of sudden madness. It had been planned, and with cunning. Whoever had placed that card wished to confuse, to unsettle, perhaps to draw the eye in one direction while hiding another truth entirely. Miss Marple, who knew all too well the way human nature repeated itself in villages and cities alike, could already feel the shape of the puzzle forming Dot. But puzzles, she reminded herself, were never solved in haste. They required patience, observation, and the willingness to see not only what was shown, but also what was carefully concealed. As the sun dipped lower over St. Mary Mead, throwing long shadows across the silent tea table, Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting once again in hand. To those around her, she seemed the picture of harmless age and distraction. In truth, her mind was already turning over the unsolvable crime, seeking the thread that would unravel it. The evening wore on, with the garden still cloaked in an uneasy hush, the teacups untouched on the table, the guests unwilling to look at one another for too long. The constable, flustered and uncertain, had done his best to keep order, yet it was plain that routine questions and hasty notes would not uncover the truth. Most of those present seemed eager to go home, to put distance between themselves and the wicker chair where Mrs. Lytton's lifeless form still sat, but they were not permitted to leave. It was in that atmosphere of suppressed nerves and barely concealed impatience that Miss Marple quietly moved among them, her manner gentle, her eyes sharp. To any who looked, she was nothing more than an elderly spinster, showing polite concern, offering a handkerchief to the vicar's wife, murmuring soft words of comfort to Lucy, or commenting mildly on the constable's diligence. Yet behind her soft tones, her mind was at work, arranging fragments of observation like pieces of lace. She had long ago learned that when people thought her absent-minded, they revealed themselves with dangerous carelessness. She noticed, for instance, how Mr. Harcourt kept glancing toward the tea service as if it might betray him, his fingers restless against the chain of his watch. A respectable banker, yes, but she remembered stories of speculative ventures gone sour, whispers of debts spoken of only in hushed tones. Mrs. Lytton had been known to hold influence over village committees and charitable funds. Was there some quarrel of money between them? His forced bluster earlier now seemed like the noise of a man desperate to smother unease. Lucy, meanwhile, remained apart, her grief oddly measured. She cried in moments that seemed almost rehearsed, the sound rising and falling with unnatural precision, and when Miss Marple offered her a cup of water, Lucy's hand trembled, not with sorrow, but with watchful anxiety, her eyes darting toward the doctor and constable as if afraid they might suddenly turn their questions upon her. Miss Marple tucked this observation away quietly, saying nothing, but she felt certain that Lucy knew more than she wished to reveal. Then there was Mrs. Trent, resplendent even in her widow's attire, who seemed more amused than distressed by the tragedy. She adjusted her hat once more, though it had not shifted in the slightest, and when she caught Miss Marple watching her, she returned a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. Miss Marple, who had often said that a hat could be as revealing as a diary, made a mental note to look closer at that particular ornament. The constable, meanwhile, had discovered nothing new beyond repeating his questions with louder insistence. "The card, ma'am," he said for the third time, waving the damp 3 of hearts as though it were the crown jewel of evidence. "No one admits to owning it. Strange business, eh? Perhaps the murderer meant to leave his mark." "Or her mark," Miss Marple said softly, which made the man blink. He had not considered that possibility. She smiled kindly at him, as though to reassure him that his efforts were not wasted, and then bent to examine the card herself. The edges were faintly stained with tea, but beneath the wetness the ink looked brighter than expected, fresher somehow, as though the card had not been carried in someone's pocket for long. Instead, it seemed to have been taken from a new pack, perhaps only recently opened. It was a small thing, easily missed, but it stirred Miss Marple's suspicions. While the doctor finally insisted that Mrs. Lytton's body be moved indoors, Miss Marple lingered near the tea table. She studied the cups, the sugar bowl, the milk jug, her expression one of harmless curiosity. The cups had been neatly stacked, at the beginning identical in shape and design, yet she saw now that one saucer bore a faint chip along its rim, a flaw easily overlooked, and it was upon this very saucer that Mrs. Lytton's cup had rested. Had someone chosen that particular, saucer, placing it with deliberate care where Mrs. Lytton was certain to sit. The idea was plausible. After all, Mrs. Lytton always presided at the head of the table. A careful hand could have arranged her place in advance, unseen amid the bustle of preparation. It was a subtle detail, but Miss Marple knew that in matters of murder, subtlety often spelled the difference between accident and intent. As the evening shadows lengthened, she returned quietly to her seat, knitting in hand, though the needles never moved. She watched once more as the guests grew restless, eager to return to their homes. It was then she caught the smallest of gestures, Mr. Harcourt reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a handkerchief. For the briefest moment as he unfolded it, Miss Marple's eyes glimpsed the corner of another card tucked within, its edge peeking like a guilty secret, before he hastily stuffed the cloth away again. He had seen her glance, of that she was sure, for his face flushed crimson, and he busied himself at once with mopping his brow. She said nothing. A rash accusation would serve no purpose, and she could not yet be certain of what she had seen. But her mind was quickening now, weaving together the peculiar card, the chipped saucer, the uneasy glances, and the measured grief. Each detail might seem trivial, yet together they formed the faint outline of deception. Still, the picture was incomplete. Someone had wanted Mrs. Lytton dead, and had gone to considerable lengths to make it appear both baffling and careless. Poison was not the weapon of passion. It was chosen by those who planned, who thought ahead, who waited for the right moment. And in this garden, filled with polite chatter and the clink of china, the right moment had been crafted with chilling precision. As the constable finally dismissed the guests for the night, taking names and promising further questions, Miss Marple rose with quiet grace. To the casual eye she seemed nothing more than an elderly woman, weary from the shock of the afternoon. But as she walked home through the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead, her mind sharpened like a blade. She had seen enough to know that deception was already at play, that someone's performance, be it of grief, of outrage, or of calm, was just that, a performance. And performances, she knew, always revealed their cracks if one watched long enough. The following morning dawned grey and heavy, a fine drizzle clinging to the hedgerows and rooftops of St. Mary Mead. The village seemed hushed, as if reluctant, to speak of the horror that had unfolded at so respectable an occasion. Yet behind lace curtains and polished windows, whispers spread as quickly as ivy. Who had poisoned Dorothy Lytton, and why? The constable, true to his word, summoned each guest to the vicarage to give a proper statement. It was there, amid the smell of damp wool coats and the ticking of the grandfather clock, that voices began to weave a tangled net of truths, half-truths, and carefully chosen lies. Miss Marple was present, of course, not officially, but as a trusted figure whose presence seemed to soothe nervous tempers. She sat quietly with her knitting bag at her feet, her needles clicking softly, while the constable did his best to proceed with authority. Yet it was she, not the uniformed man, who listened with an ear trained to catch the faintest note of falsehood. Mr. Harcourt was called first. He settled into the chair with a theatrical sigh, pulling at his watch chain as if to remind everyone of his importance. His account was brisk, almost rehearsed. Mrs. Lytton had been in fine health until she sipped her tea. He himself had used the sugar bowl and milk jug without incident. He had noticed nothing unusual save for her sudden collapse. He ended by insisting that he, like the others, was utterly baffled by the business. But Miss Marple noted how his gaze darted toward the table where the evidence had been placed, the tea service, the china cups, and the single playing card sealed in a paper envelope. His voice carried an edge of impatience, too, as though he wished to be gone quickly. When the constable asked if he had seen the card before, Harcourt laughed too loudly. Her card at a tea party? Preposterous. I play whist, yes, but never have I seen such nonsense in all my days. The denial was too emphatic, Miss Marple thought, like a man whistling in the dark. Lucy followed. She looked pale, her eyes reddened, her handkerchief damp with tears. Yet her grief seemed oddly mechanical, rising in sobs at convenient intervals. She insisted that her aunt had been kind, that she could not imagine anyone wishing her harm. When asked if Mrs. Lytton had quarrelled with anyone recently, Lucy hesitated, then shook her head too quickly. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly, watching the girl's hands twist the fabric of her dress. Lucy's voice trembled, yet her words lacked conviction, as if she recited what she thought should be said rather than what she truly knew. The vicar's wife, timid and fluttering, provided a meandering account. She spoke at length about the arrangement of flowers on the table, the quality of the scones, the unfortunate stain she had noticed on one of the napkins, until the constable grew visibly weary. Only when pressed did she say that she had seen Mrs. Trent leaning close to Mrs. Lytton during the tea, whispering something that made the older woman stiffen in her chair. It was a small detail, given almost as an afterthought, but Miss Marple caught it at once. Mrs. Trent had whispered. What could have been said at such a moment? When Mrs. Trent herself was summoned, she entered with her head held high, her hat plumes quivering like banners of defiance. Her account was smooth, confident, even tinged with amusement. She declared that she had noticed nothing out of the ordinary, that she had chatted with several guests about harmless topics, and that she had been as shocked as anyone when Dorothy collapsed. When asked about whispering to the victim, she laughed, lightly. "We women share confidences, Constable. Surely you don't suspect me of conspiring in broad daylight." But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime listening to village gossip, recognized the deflection. Mrs. Trent spoke too smoothly, too perfectly, as though she had polished her story overnight. And when her gloved hand brushed her hat, adjusting it yet again, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That repeated gesture hinted at something concealed, not merely vanity, but perhaps an object hidden within the elaborate folds of fabric and feather. Other guests were called in turn, each offering fragments of memory that seemed to contradict one another in subtle ways. One swore Mrs. Lytton had poured her own tea. Another insisted she had been served by Lucy. Some claimed the card had been on the ground before the collapse, others that it appeared only afterward. The sugar bowl was said by some to be nearly full, by others nearly empty. Each statement tangled the timeline further, until the constable grew exasperated. Miss Marple, however, saw the value in these contradictions. It was not the card or the sugar that told the truth, but the way people clung to their own version. Too much eagerness betrayed invention, while hesitation often betrayed knowledge withheld. She thought of Mr. Harcourt's too loud denial, Lucy's too quick defense of her aunt's supposed harmony with all, Mrs. Trent's polished charm, and the vicar's wife's nervous fluttering. Each voice revealed not clarity, but deception. When the questioning ended and the room thinned of suspects, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting untouched in her lap. She recalled the chipped saucer she had noticed, the glimpse of a card in Harcourt's pocket, the whispered word from Mrs. Trent and Lucy's uneasy manner. Threads, all of them, threads waiting to be drawn together. As the constable gathered his notes, muttering that the case was devilish confusing, Miss Marple spoke softly, her eyes fixed on her knitting. "Human nature is often confusing. Constable, people deceive themselves as much as others, but if one listens carefully, the truth always speaks between the words." The constable, not quite sure what she meant, nodded and left her to her thoughts. But Miss Marple already knew that among the polite denials and rehearsed grief, she had heard something real, something that would, in time, point directly to the hand that had poured death into a teacup. The drizzle gave way to a damp, restless afternoon, the sort of weather that seemed to mirror the mood of St. Mary Mead. By now the gossip had spread beyond the tea party's guests, and the village was alive with speculation. Some whispered that Dorothy Lytton had been punished for her sharp tongue. Others that she had enemies in her charitable dealings, and a few, more dramatic souls insisted on a tale of secret lovers and betrayal. But while rumour spun its wild webs, Miss Marple preferred the quiet weaving of her own, one drawn from observation, memory, and the small inconsistencies that people hoped would go unnoticed. She sat by her window that afternoon, knitting idle in her lap, reflecting on the statements she had heard. The threads of motive stretched in many directions, each plausible yet incomplete. It was like staring at a half-finished piece of lace. The pattern suggested itself, but the connections were not yet tight enough to hold. Mr. Harcourt, for example, loomed large in her mind. A man of money and reputation, but not, she suspected, of security. She had seen him slip a card back into his pocket, the edge of which betrayed him. Why should he have such a card when he so vehemently denied knowledge of it? More troubling. Still were the whispers she recalled from the post office some weeks back. Investments gone wrong. Talk of angry creditors. Dorothy Lytton, as head of several charitable committees, oversaw funds that Mr. Harcourt had been eager to guide into more lucrative ventures. Dorothy, shrewd and suspicious, would never have allowed it. Could it be that Harcourt's reputation, perhaps even his livelihood, depended on silencing her? Then there was young Lucy, pretty, delicate, the picture of a grieving niece, yet her grief rang false. Dorothy Lytton had taken her in years ago after her parents' passing, raising her with stern discipline and, if rumors were to be believed, a heavy hand. Lucy was said to have longed for independence, for her own way in the world. Miss Marple recalled that Dorothy had often spoken of leaving her estate not to Lucy, but to the church, a decision that would leave the girl with little but a memory. Resentment could fester quietly for years, and when the opportunity presented, itself a chipped saucer, a cup set aside, might Lucy have seized it? And yet Lucy seemed far too unsteady, her fear more that of exposure than triumph. If she had done it, why play the part so poorly? Mrs. Trent was another matter altogether. Elegant, composed, she had whispered something sharp into Dorothy's ear just before the collapse. Miss Marple could almost hear it now, the sudden intake of Dorothy's breath, the stiffening of her shoulders. Words had power, and in Mrs. Trent's case perhaps they were edged with threat. Dorothy had known her since girlhood, and old rivalries often lingered long past youth. Some claimed Mrs. Trent had once sought the affections of the same man Dorothy married. Others muttered about a quarrel over land and inheritance. And then there was her hat, adjusted too often as though hiding not vanity but intent. Could she have carried the poisoned card in some secret fold, slipping it into Dorothy's saucer with the stealth of long practice? Her poise, her laughter, her charm, it was all too polished, like a mask fitted tightly over something more dangerous. The vicar's wife, though timid and seemingly harmless, had her own shadow of motive. Dorothy had often criticized her, sometimes cruelly, about her household, her parish duties, even the quality of her cakes at the fair. 1,000 small humiliations, endured year after year, could build into bitterness. Yet Miss Marple could not picture her as a poisoner. She fluttered too much, spoke too long about trivialities. Still, she had been close to the tea table, bustling with scones and flowers, her hands everywhere at once. A woman so overlooked might easily act unnoticed. The motives stretched further. Some whispered that Dorothy had discovered letters not meant for her eyes, secrets that might tarnish reputations if revealed. Others believed she had threatened to expose dealings that were better left hidden. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that beneath the gentility of village life lay greed, jealousy, fear, and revenge, each wound tight and waiting to spring. Yet no single theory explained everything. If it were Harcourt, why the card? If Lucy, why the whisper that preceded the collapse? If Mrs. Trent, why use poison when words alone seemed her weapon of choice? And if the vicar's wife, why so clumsy in grief yet so careful with detail? The web was tangled, the threads pulling in all directions, but Miss Marple trusted that with patience a pattern would emerge. She began, as was her way, to test each thread against the others. Suppose Harcourt had brought the card to frighten Dorothy, a threat to remind her that he held some secret over her. Could Lucy have found it and turned it into a weapon of her own, lacing Dorothy's cup with poison to ensure her aunt never changed her will? And what of Mrs. Trent? Whispering perhaps not a threat but a warning. Had she known something was about to happen and chosen to gloat rather than stop it? Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Human nature was rarely so neat. More often, crimes arose from overlapping motives, where two people wished the same person gone for different reasons, and chance decided whose hand delivered the fatal blow. She thought again of the chipped saucer, the placement of the tea service, the deliberate act of arranging Dorothy's place. That spoke not of impulse but of foresight. Someone had planned this carefully, and planning was the mark not of rage but of necessity. The constable, burdened with his notes, and none the wiser, called again that evening to consult Miss Marple. "It's a maze, ma'am," he confessed, rubbing his brow. "Every one of them had cause, but I can't see how the pieces fit together." "Ah, but they do fit," Miss Marple said gently. "One mustn't look only at who could have done it, but at who would have chosen this way. Poison is an intimate weapon, Constable. It requires calm, patience, and a certain kind of malice. Think of who possesses those qualities, and you may find your maze grows less confusing," she returned, to her knitting, the needles moving now in steady rhythm. In her mind, the suspects shifted and rearranged like figures on a chessboard. Each carried their motive like a hidden weight, some light, some heavy, but all real. What remained was to discover who had taken motive and shaped it into murder, and why the strange little card, the 3 of Hearts, had been left like a calling. Mark at the scene. The web of deception was tightening, but Miss Marple knew it was not yet strong enough to catch the truth. That moment, she thought, would come soon. And when it did, the pattern that seemed so tangled now would appear inevitable, as all human wickedness eventually does when set against the clarity of reason. By the following day, the case that had so unsettled the genteel calm of St. Mary, Mead seemed, at least to the authorities, to be drawing to a close. The constable, tired of confusion and eager for resolution, arrived at the vicarage with a newfound confidence. He carried with him not only his notes, but also what he believed was a decisive piece of evidence. The news spread quickly through the village. The mystery of Dorothy Lytton's death had been solved, or so it appeared. The constable summoned the chief suspects once more. They gathered in the parlour, their faces betraying varying shades of dread, defiance, and fatigue. Mr. Harcourt sat stiffly, his lips pressed tight. Lucy wrung her hands until her knuckles turned white. Mrs. Trent tilted her chin as though prepared for battle, and the vicar's wife looked ready to faint. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting on her lap, watched quietly, her expression one of mild interest. The constable began with a flourish. "We've found the source of the poison," he declared, holding up a small vial. "It was discovered in the shed behind Mr. Harcourt's house, hidden among garden tools. Further, we have evidence that Mr. Harcourt recently purchased arsenic under the pretense of controlling pests." A murmur rippled through the room. Harcourt's face darkened to an alarming shade of red. "For roses," he protested, his voice booming. "Arsenic is a common enough purchase for gardeners. My roses have been plagued with greenfly this season. That proves nothing." But the constable pressed on, emboldened. "Combined with your behaviour at the tea party, sir, and your financial entanglements with Mrs. Lytton, it paints a very convincing picture. You had both motive and means," the vicar's wife gasped. Lucy let out a muffled sob, and Mrs. Trent smirked as though privately amused. Harcourt thumped his fist on the arm of his chair. "Nonsense. She poured her own tea, same as the rest of us. You cannot say I slipped poison into her cup under everyone's noses." The constable raised the small playing card, now carefully dried and pressed flat. "And then there is this. In your pocket, a card from the same pack was seen. The 3 of Hearts left by Mrs. Lytton's body ties directly to you." The banker's hands trembled as he fumbled with his watch chain, but he met their eyes fiercely. I had cards with me, yes. A game of whist at the club the night before, but that proves nothing. Are you to condemn a man because he carries a handkerchief and a card?" The constable looked triumphant nonetheless. To him the matter was clear. Harcourt had debts, Dorothy Lytton had blocked him, and in desperation he had poisoned her during the tea party, leaving behind a foolish token in the form of the card. Case closed. There was relief in the room, even among the guests. A culprit identified meant the nightmare was over. Lucy wept more openly now, though her tears seemed to carry a strange undercurrent. Was it grief, or perhaps relief for another reason? Mrs. Trent leaned back in her chair, eyes glittering with something that looked very much like satisfaction. Yet Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. She tilted her head slightly, watching Harcourt not with the suspicion the others carried, but with a certain curiosity. His outrage seemed genuine, his bluster not merely the act of a guilty man, but of one unjustly cornered. She thought again of the chipped saucer, of Mrs. Trent's whispered words, of Lucy's rehearsed grief, and she thought of the poison itself. If Harcourt had intended to kill Dorothy in such a public way, would he have chosen a method so obvious as arsenic, so traceable to his own household? When the gathering broke, the constable all but declared the matter settled, promising to move quickly toward formal charges. Harcourt was left to sputter his indignation, though his face betrayed a flicker of fear. The others dispersed in uneasy clusters, eager to believe the danger had passed. Miss Marple, however, lingered. She bent closer to the fire, warming her hands, though her mind was far from the flames. The case was not solved, not in her estimation. She had lived too long and seen too much to believe in victories won so easily. The presence of the card, the chipped saucer, the whisper, none of these fit comfortably into the picture painted by the constable. As she walked home through the mist that evening, she considered how often in village life people clutched at explanations that brought comfort rather than truth. The constable had his neat solution, the village had its culprit to gossip about, and perhaps even the true murderer felt a surge of relief, hidden in the shadows, knowing suspicion had shifted elsewhere. That was the danger of false victories. They blinded those eager for closure, while leaving the real threat very much alive. And Miss Marple, sharp-eyed and patient, knew this was far from over. The killer was still among them, watching, waiting, confident enough to let another man bear the blame. It was a confidence she intended to undo, thread by careful thread, until the truth revealed itself inescapably. The arrest of Mr. Harcourt was the talk of St. Mary Mead. In the shops and along the hedgerows, villagers spoke with relish of his downfall, shaking their heads as if the banker's disgrace were both shocking and inevitable. To most, the constable's case was watertight. Arsenic in his shed, debts at the bank, and that curious card in his pocket. Yet to Miss Marple, the very tidiness of the accusation rang hollow. She had long known that real life seldom tied itself up so neatly, especially when human malice was involved. The following morning, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village. To the casual eye, she was simply an elderly lady with her shopping basket, pausing to admire chrysanthemums or exchange pleasantries about the weather. But beneath her mild questions and thoughtful nods, she was quietly gathering threads. People often spoke too freely when they thought a matter already solved, and in those careless words, truths tended to surface. At the post office, Miss Hartnell was full of gossip. "They say Mr. Harcourt bought arsenic just a week ago, bold as brass. Too, but it doesn't surprise me. His roses, indeed. I've heard tell he lost a small fortune last year." Dorothy Lytton wasn't the sort to look kindly on reckless men. She could be very sharp when she liked. Sharp indeed, thought Miss Marple, sharp enough to make enemies. Yet as she listened, another detail pricked her mind, one she had nearly forgotten. Dorothy Lytton had not always lived in St. Mary Mead. Years ago she had come from another parish after the sudden death of her husband, a quiet man, seldom spoken of, who had collapsed one evening at supper. The cause had been deemed natural heart failure. But Miss Marple, with her memory for odd whispers, recalled hearing doubts at the time. "Strange business," someone had remarked years ago. "So sudden, and Dorothy not half so affected as you'd expect." It was nothing concrete, but it lingered now like a faint echo that refused to fade. A woman touched once by sudden, unexplained death might well find herself touched again. And if her husband's passing had not been as innocent as it seemed, then perhaps the poisoner at the tea party had roots in something long buried. That evening, Miss Marple sorted through parish records in the vicar's study, with his kind permission. She found what she sought. Dorothy's late husband had indeed died 20 years earlier, leaving his modest estate entirely to her. But curiously, she had not been the sole beneficiary. Another name appeared in the will, one Violet Trent. The bequest was small, a mere token, but it suggested an old connection between the two households. Long before Dorothy settled in St. Mary Mead, the whisper of Mrs. Trent leaning over Dorothy at the tea party took on a new weight. Their rivalry, so often dismissed, as social sparring, had deeper roots. Could it be that what happened years ago, perhaps something long concealed, still lingered between them. The next day, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Trent under the pretext of admiring her garden. The widow, always eager to display her roses and gladioli, received her warmly. As they strolled among the beds, Miss Marple mentioned Dorothy's late husband in a tone of idle reminiscence. For the briefest instant, Mrs. Trent's composure faltered. She adjusted her hat yet again, her gloved fingers trembling ever so slightly. "He was a dull man," Mrs. Trent said finally, her voice too brisk. Dorothy made the most of her widowhood. It suited her. The answer was too sharp, too prepared, and Miss Marple, who had learned long ago to notice when people avoided what they most wished to hide, stored the reaction carefully in her mind. Meanwhile, Lucy's behavior continued to trouble her. The girl's tears came too easily, her grief too rehearsed. But what if her unease was not about inheritance at all? What if she feared the exposure of some family scandal buried in the past? Lucy was young, but she had grown up under Dorothy's roof, privy to whispers, perhaps even confidences meant never to be repeated. And in that household, with Dorothy's stern tongue and iron will, secrets would have festered like weeds beneath the roses. The web began to widen. Harcourt's debts tied him to Dorothy in the present, but Mrs. Trent's old connection linked her to Dorothy's past. Lucy straddled both worlds, the inheritance yet to come, and the legacy already lived. And if Dorothy's husband had not died of natural causes, if suspicion had shadowed his passing even faintly, then perhaps someone had long harbored fear that Dorothy herself might speak of it one day. Fear, Miss Marple knew, was as strong a motive as greed or jealousy. That evening, alone in her cottage, she laid aside her knitting and thought deeply. The chipped saucer, the playing card, the misplaced hat adjustment, all were important. But more telling was the pattern that emerged. Dorothy Litton's death was not an isolated act of malice, sprung from sudden quarrel or passing spite. It was the echo of something older, something rooted in forgotten enmities and buried scandals. The constable believed he had solved the crime by seizing upon arsenic in a banker's shed, but Miss Marple saw further. This was not simply the matter of Harcourt's debts or Lucy's inheritance. It was a crime with long roots, tangled deep in the soil of the past, where Dorothy herself had planted seeds of resentment years before. Somewhere in that past lay the true connection, the hidden bond that linked Harcourt, Lucy, and Mrs. Trent in ways they might not even realize themselves. And until that bond was uncovered, the real murderer would remain hidden, their confidence growing as the village congratulated itself on a case closed too quickly. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the faint smile of memory playing at her lips. In her mind, she compared the puzzle to her lacework. The older threads often dictated the final pattern, though they seemed invisible at first. The murder at the tea party was no different. To solve it, she must trace not only the fresh stitches of yesterday, but also the worn, faded threads of years long gone. Miss Marple knew the case would never unravel through mere repetition of questions or reliance on the constable's evidence. People lied, people acted, people concealed, and the more they were pressed, the tighter their defenses became. What was needed now was not confrontation, but a needle slipped quietly into the fabric of their composure. She had seen it work. Often enough, an unexpected remark, a harmless-seeming test, or even the mention of something ordinary could bring forth truth that hours of formal questioning would never yield. The opportunity came 2 days after Mr. Harcourt's arrest. Inspector Graves, still convinced he had his man, agreed to hold a small gathering of the tea party guests in the Vicar's Hall to clear up loose ends. He was indulgent enough to let Miss Marple sit in. She sat knitting at the edge of the group, her needles clicking softly, appearing the very picture of irrelevance. But her mind was sharp, waiting for the moment to slip her own test into the conversation. The group assembled. Mrs. Trent, upright and austere, her gloves immaculate. Lucy, pale and nervous, wringing her handkerchief until it looked nearly shredded. And a few others who had lingered in the background of the case. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Trent's eyes never quite settled, always scanning, always watching, and Lucy's glances fell too often on the inspector, as though pleading for reassurance. The inspector opened the meeting with a brusque summary. Evidence points squarely to Mr. Harcourt. We've found means, motive and opportunity. However, it may assist the record to hear from you all once more. It was the moment Miss Marple had been waiting for. She leaned forward gently, her knitting in her lap, and said in her mildest tone, "Such a pity about that teacup, isn't it? One hardly knows what to think when something so familiar becomes the bearer of harm. I remember when poor Mr. Lytton died, many years ago now. He had taken a cup of tea just before, had he not? Quite the coincidence, really. The effect was instant and telling." Lucy stiffened in her chair, her lips parting as though she might speak but dared not. Mrs. Trent's hands faltered over her gloves, smoothing them again and again as colour drained from her cheeks. Miss Marple did not press further. She simply smiled vaguely, as if her words had been nothing more than idle chatter. But she had seen the reaction she sought, not surprise, not confusion, but guilt, or at least the sting of memory. Inspector Graves, missing the subtlety, was preparing to move on when Miss Marple added, "It is curious, isn't it, how certain things remain with one? For instance, the saucer at the tea party, chipped along the edge. I dare say most would not notice, but such flaws stand out to those who take care with china. I wonder, did either of you notice it?" Lucy shook her head at once, too quickly. "No, I didn't." But Mrs. Trent hesitated, her composure cracking for the briefest instant. "Yes," she said slowly, "I noticed. But what of it? A chipped saucer is hardly evidence of murder." Indeed, Miss Marple agreed soothingly. "Yet one does wonder why such a saucer was chosen from a set otherwise quite perfect. A curious oversight, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Trent said nothing more, but her silence was heavier than words. The meeting ended without further revelations, but Miss Marple left satisfied. The mention of Dorothy's late husband had pricked two nerves at once, and the chipped saucer had touched upon a detail someone wished forgotten. These reactions, so small yet so revealing, confirmed what she already suspected. The crime had roots in the past, and at least one of these women knew far more than she admitted. That evening, Miss Marple took her walk past the Lytton cottage. It was shuttered now, its mistress gone, the garden already beginning to wilt. She paused at the gate, her mind knitting together threads as deftly as her fingers managed yarn. Dorothy's husband had died after tea. Dorothy herself had died after tea. Two deaths 20 years apart, linked by the same domestic ritual. Coincidence was possible, but Miss Marple never believed in too many coincidences. She recalled Lucy's expression when Dorothy's husband was mentioned. Fear, pure and unguarded. The girl had not even been born then, but she had grown up surrounded by whispers. Was it guilt by inheritance or dread that a family secret might come to light? And Mrs. Trent, her hat forever adjusted, her gloves forever smoothed, as though she might polish away the past itself. Her denial had been too swift, her knowledge too exact. People did not usually remember a chipped saucer, unless they had a reason to. The next day, Miss Marple employed another small test. She invited both Lucy and Mrs. Trent to tea at her cottage, offering them mismatched cups and saucers from her cupboard. With studied carelessness, she served Mrs. Trent from a slightly cracked teacup. The woman flinched visibly, staring at the floor before lifting it to her lips. Lucy, by contrast, seemed not to notice at all. "Dear me," Miss Marple said sweetly, "I do hope you don't mind the imperfection. One mustn't waste perfectly good china for the sake of a little crack. Still, I sometimes think such things hold memories of their own." Mrs. Trent nearly dropped the cup. Her hand trembled, tea sloshing over the rim, and she forced a tight smile. "Quite so, Miss Marple, quite so." The reaction confirmed it. The clue was not about arsenic or roses or financial debts. It was about the vessel of death itself, the cup and saucer, a reminder of something once done before. Mrs. Trent's nerves betrayed her more than any evidence could. When they left, Miss Marple sat down by her window, gazing out at the evening sky. The pattern was clearer now. Dorothy Lytton had lived under a shadow for years, whether she knew it or not. Her past, intertwined with Mrs. Trent's, had finally caught up with her. But the exact shape of that shadow, who wielded it, and why remained just beyond reach. Still, She had pulled a thread loose. The deception was beginning to fray, and once it did, the whole fabric of lies would unravel. The morning after her little experiment with the mismatched teacups, Miss Marple rose early, determined to speak again with Inspector Graves. She had no intention of accusing anyone outright, but she meant to suggest, ever so gently, that the case against Mr. Harcourt might not be as ironclad as he believed. Evidence could be planted, after all, and people who looked guilty often weren't the true culprits. She tucked her notes, scrawled neatly in her precise handwriting, into a small envelope and set out for the station. But when she arrived, she found the inspector pacing furiously, his face a thundercloud. "Confound it!" he snapped, slamming his fist onto the desk. "The arsenic's gone." Miss Marple blinked, her blue eyes wide with polite surprise. "Gone, Inspector? Surely you mean misplaced." "Stolen," he growled. "The very bottle we seized from Harcourt's shed, the linchpin of our case, locked in the evidence cabinet last night. This morning the cabinet was open and the bottle gone." Miss Marple did not need to ask what that meant. Someone was working very hard to keep the truth out of reach. If Harcourt were guilty, why bother removing the very thing that condemned him? No, the theft smacked of desperation. It was the act of someone who feared the wrong questions might be asked, or that the evidence might not withstand closer scrutiny. The inspector was furious, but Miss Marple merely folded her hands. "I should not worry yourself too greatly, Inspector. Bottles and cabinets are physical things easily lost or taken. But memory, that is not so easily stolen. Sometimes the smallest recollection serves better than the largest piece of evidence." The inspector muttered something about old women's tales, but Miss Marple's mind was already moving elsewhere. The bottle was not gone by chance. Someone had risked discovery, crept into the station and tampered with police property. That was no small thing. Only desperation could drive such a bold act. Later that day, Miss Marple strolled past Mrs. Trent's cottage and noticed curtains twitch hastily shut as she approached. At the grocer's, Lucy was pale and withdrawn, her basket hanging half-empty at her side. Gossip buzzed that Harcourt had written a letter from his cell, proclaiming his innocence in a tone of indignation rather than fear. The village hummed, with unease, suspicion spreading like ivy over stone walls. That evening, Miss Marple paid a discreet call on Constable Barnes, a young man more easily swayed by kindness than his superior. "Over tea and seed cake?" she asked in her gentle, roundabout way, whether anyone unusual had been near the station the night before. The constable hesitated, then admitted he had seen a shadow slipping across the lane, a small figure in a dark cloak. He had thought it no more than Mrs. Price returning late from tending her sister, but now with the bottle missing, Miss Marple did not press him further. A small figure in a cloak could describe half the widows in St. Mary Mead, and naming one without proof would do no good. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. Whoever it was had moved under cover of night, had knowledge of the evidence. Cabinet, and above all, had something to lose if the arsenic were examined too closely. The next morning, a new shock awaited them all. The chipped saucer, Miss Marple's quiet key to unravelling the case, was gone as well. Lucy, in a fit of nerves or perhaps a performance of them, claimed she had knocked it from the counter while tidying Dorothy's kitchen. But when Miss Marple inspected the bin where it was said to have fallen, there was nothing but clean shards, neatly wrapped in paper, as though someone had taken great care to destroy it beyond recognition. "A dreadful accident," Lucy murmured, wringing her hands. "I feel so clumsy, Miss Marple." But Miss Marple did not believe in accidents that occurred at such convenient moments. The saucer's disappearance confirmed what the missing arsenic had already suggested. Someone was erasing the past piece by piece before the truth could be uncovered. The stakes had risen. No longer was it simply a matter of identifying a murderer. Now the murderer, or their ally, was actively working against the investigation, pushing the case toward ruin. Trust, always a fragile commodity, seemed to splinter further with every passing hour. Miss Marple returned home that evening, with her knitting basket clutched tighter than usual. In the quiet of her sitting room, she allowed her thoughts to unspool. The thief had revealed something without meaning to. Fear. Not the fear of discovery, but the fear of what those items would prove if properly examined. The arsenic bottle might have shown fingerprints that did not belong to Harcourt. The saucer might have borne traces of tampering, perhaps powder rubbed, into the porcelain where the poison had been administered. To remove both was to admit they mattered, and in her long experience, only the guilty risked so much to obliterate the inconvenient dot. Yet who was guilty? Harcourt sat in a cell, loudly proclaiming his innocence. Lucy destroyed the saucer, or so she said. Mrs. Trent flinched at every mention of Dorothy's past. Each played their part in this dangerous charade, but only one hand had dared slip into the lion's den of the station. That hand, Miss Marple resolved, would soon enough betray itself again. She set down her knitting with a quiet sigh. The game had turned sharper now, the lines more dangerous. Evidence could be stolen or broken, but truth had a way of surfacing like oil rising on water. And Miss Marple, patient as ever, meant to watch the ripples until the source was revealed. The village of St. Mary Mead was already unsettled, but the disappearance of the arsenic and the destruction of the saucer had driven gossip into a fever pitch. Miss Marple, however, remained quiet, listening more than speaking, watching the subtle shifts in expression when Dorothy Lytton's name was mentioned. Fear hung in the air, sharper now than grief. And when fear grows too thick, Miss Marple knew it often erupts into violence. Her premonition proved right. 2 nights later, a shriek tore through the stillness of the lane near Mrs. Trent's house. Villagers rushed from their cottages with lanterns, the yellow beams cutting across hedgerows and gravel paths. They found Lucy, collapsed at the gate, her face pale as death. She was alive, though trembling uncontrollably, her eyes darting wildly. As if she had seen a ghost. Between gasps, she stammered that someone had attacked her from behind, a gloved hand pressing over her mouth, the gleam of metal in the dark. She had managed to twist free only because the attacker stumbled against the gatepost, losing his grip long enough for her to scream. No one saw the assailant's face. No one heard retreating footsteps. Inspector Graves wasted no time in declaring it proof that Harcourt's accomplice was at large. He ordered men to patrol the village lanes, and Lucy was sent to rest under the vicar's watchful eye. But Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the crowd with her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, was troubled. An attack so clumsy, so loud, seemed ill-suited to a calculating mind. Unless, of course, it was meant not to kill but to frighten, to silence Lucy before she said too much. The following morning, Miss Marple visited Lucy at the vicarage. The girl lay pale in bed, her hands twisting the sheets. She insisted she remembered nothing beyond the hand and the knife's glint. Yet when Miss Marple, in her gentle way, asked why she had been out so late alone, Lucy faltered. I was going to see Mrs. Trent. She sent for me. A note came asking me to bring some papers of Aunt Dorothy's, but when I arrived her windows were dark. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained soft. And what became of the note, my dear? Lucy flushed and looked away. I don't know, I must have dropped it in the struggle. A note conveniently vanished, an attacker conveniently unseen. To Miss Marple, it smelled less of chance than design. Later that day, the inspector called. Another meeting in the hall. He was red-faced and furious, railing about accomplices and village gossip. But when he revealed Harcourt had attempted to take his own life in his cell, thwarted only by the timely intervention of a guard, the case twisted again. The man's despair seemed genuine, his insistence on innocence desperate and unrelenting. Could such a soul bent on his own destruction truly have the cunning to orchestrate arsenic, vanished evidence and late-night attacks? Miss Marple thought not. The pieces did not fit. Someone else was pulling strings, and Harcourt, blustering and ruined, was a convenient scapegoat. She walked home slowly through the dusk, mulling each thread. Lucy, with her fragile nerves, might invent fears, but her terror the night of the attack had been real. Mrs. Trent's composure cracked at every reminder of the past, and now Harcourt's near death was yet another reminder that the true villain was several steps ahead. Removing obstacles one by one. At her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a quiet cup of tea and stared at the steam curling above it. Dorothy's death had not ended matters. Someone feared exposure so much that they were willing to silence Lucy, willing to tamper with evidence, willing even to drive an innocent man to despair. The case had changed. It was no longer simply about who killed Dorothy Lytton, but who still stood ready to kill again. As she sat in the lamplight, Miss Marple felt the chill of realization creep over her. The villain was not merely a poisoner hiding behind respectability. They were bold, calculating, and dangerous enough to strike twice. The next move would not be made in panic. It would be deliberate, and if not stopped, it would succeed. For the first time since the investigation began, Miss Marple admitted quietly to herself that she might not just be solving a crime, but preventing a third death. And perhaps, if she wasn't careful, she might even find herself in danger. Miss Marple spent the next day in quiet observation, letting the village chatter wash over her as if she were no more than a kindly old lady, nodding along to gossip. But beneath her gentle smiles, her mind was working ceaselessly, weaving together every contradiction, every frightened glance, every accidental mishap. Too many threads had been tugged loose for the pattern to remain hidden much longer. At the grocer's Mrs. Price spoke of Lucy's attack in hushed tones. "Poor child, trembling like a leaf she is. But what I don't understand is why she was going to Mrs. Trent's so late. That house is dark after 9 o'clock sharp. Mrs. Trent has never been one to burn her lamps wastefully." It was a small remark, made without thought, but it caught Miss Marple's attention. Mrs. Trent, with her rigid habits, her careful gloves and immaculate house. Yes, she would never summon someone to call at so uncharacteristic an hour. Which meant Lucy's story about the note could not be true. Either Lucy was lying, or someone had lured her there with a forged message. Miss Marple went home, set down her basket, and sat by the window with her knitting. The wool slipped through her fingers automatically, her thoughts elsewhere. A note that vanished. A saucer that was destroyed, an arsenic bottle stolen. Always the evidence disappeared at the exact moment it threatened to point toward the real culprit. But who had both the nerve and the access to make such vanishings possible? Her mind turned to Mrs. Trent's nervous tics, the endless adjustments. Of hat and gloves, such compulsive neatness, such obsession with appearances. A person so precise would certainly notice a chipped saucer, might even resent its imperfection. Could it be that the choice of that particular cup was not chance, but deliberate? The thought led Miss Marple back, not to Dorothy, but to Dorothy's husband all those years ago. Tea then, tea now, poison before, poison again. 2 deaths, or near enough, bound together by the same domestic ritual. If Dorothy had indeed been complicit in her husband's end, as whispers once suggested, who had stood nearest to her then? Who had benefited, even if only in silence? She rose suddenly, moving to her small writing desk. From her bundle of parish notes she drew out the will she had copied at the vicarage. Dorothy's husband had left not only to his wife, but also to Violet Trent. A token bequest, yes, but enough to suggest familiarity, more than familiarity, trust. What bond could explain such a gift, except one kept carefully from the eyes of others? The lacework in her lap slipped from her fingers. That was the pattern. It had been in plain sight all along. Dorothy's death was not a single act of greed or spite, but the continuation of something older, something buried under years of silence. Mrs. Trent had always been bound to Dorothy, not just by rivalry in the present, but by some secret shared in the past. And Lucy? Miss Marple's eyes softened as she thought of the girl. Lucy knew, even if she did not know she knew. Children overheard things, remembered half-whispers, caught the tone of arguments never meant for them. Lucy's fear was not only of death, but of exposure. Perhaps Dorothy had confided something in her, a careless remark, a slip of the tongue, and Lucy had carried it like a stone in her pocket, never daring to cast it away. That would explain why someone tried to silence her, why a false note had drawn her out into the night. Miss Marple set her hands back to her knitting, her mind clearer than it had been since the beginning. The stolen arsenic, the vanished saucer, the missing note. Each disappearance was not simply an attempt to thwart the police. It was part of a pattern of control, the same tidy precision with which Mrs. Trent smoothed her gloves and adjusted her hat. She could not bear a flaw, a loose thread, a reminder of imperfection. But one loose thread remained, and Miss Marple meant to pull it. She would not accuse directly, not yet. Instead, she would let the pattern reveal itself, let Mrs. Trent's compulsions betray her. A careless word here, an innocent test there, and the neat tapestry of lies would unravel. For now, though, she kept her conclusions close, smiling to herself as she laid aside her knitting. The inspector believed the case chaotic, the village believed it cursed, but to Miss Marple, the pattern had finally begun to emerge, delicate, yet undeniable, stitched in plain sight from the very beginning. Miss Marple had always known that murder, in the end, was rarely about what it seemed. People thought of money, jealousy, or revenge as simple motives, but those were only the surface. The real reasons lay buried far deeper, in the private corners of the heart where pride, shame, and long-forgotten wounds festered. And now, as she sat by her hearth, listening to the faint ticking of the clock, she felt the truth pressing closer. Like a shadow rising behind her knitting needles, it came together in the most unassuming of ways. Miss Marple had gone to see Lucy, who was recovering from her attack under the watchful eye of her aunt. The girl looked pale, her eyes wide and restless, but when she saw Miss Marple, she clutched at her hand with sudden desperation. "Please," Lucy whispered, glancing toward the door. "Please, I didn't mean to say anything. It just slipped. I shouldn't have told anyone." "What did you tell, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle, though her heart gave a tiny leap. Lucy bit her lip, eyes brimming. That Dorothy once said she wished her husband dead. I only heard it once years ago when I was small. But Mrs. Trent was there. She heard it too, and she said—" The girl broke off, trembling. "She said she could help." Miss Marple smoothed the girl's hand. It was not the confession itself that mattered, but the tremor in Lucy's voice, the terror that had gripped her since the night Dorothy died. She knew too much, not just about the present crime, but about an old pact sealed in poison and secrecy. Later, when Miss Marple took her leave, she found her thoughts racing faster than her steps. Mrs. Trent had not merely despised Dorothy. She had been bound to her by a terrible complicity. Dorothy had wished her husband gone. Mrs. Trent, clever and meticulous, had made it happen. Perhaps out of affection for Dorothy, perhaps out of envy or a twisted sense of loyalty. But whatever the reason, the bond between them had been forged in murder. And such a bond was not easily broken. When Dorothy grew weary of her secret, when her conscience pricked or her tongue grew loose, Mrs. Trent had only one option: to silence her. Not for money, not even for the inheritance that others had suspected, but for the preservation of her own carefully ordered life. If Dorothy spoke, the past would surface. The arsenic that had ended her husband's life would be traced back. The neat gloves and tidy habits would no longer disguise the stain. That was the real motive, not greed, but fear. Fear of exposure, fear of imperfection, fear that the fragile mask of respectability Mrs. Trent had worn all these years would crumble to dust. Miss Marple remembered the way Mrs. Trent had adjusted her hat at the tea party, the almost frantic polishing of her spectacles during questioning. Those small compulsions had not been nerves alone. They had been cracks in a mask worn too long. For a woman like Violet Trent, appearances were everything. Her crime was not the rage of passion or the coldness of greed, but the desperate act of someone who could not bear her perfect world to be stained by truth. The revelation deepened when Miss Marple spoke quietly with the vicar's wife later that evening. "You know, dear Jane," she said, "Violet always admired Dorothy, though she never admitted it. I think she wanted to be her. She dressed like her, even styled her hair the same way once upon a time. It was quite uncanny." Miss Marple nodded, the final piece clicking into place. Envy, admiration, and complicity had twisted together into something darker than simple rivalry. Violet Trent had wanted Dorothy's life, perhaps even her husband once. She had helped rid Dorothy of him, and in doing so had chained herself forever to her shadow. When Dorothy threatened that bond, by remorse, by confession, or perhaps simply by living too long, Violet's delicate facade could not endure. It was not money. It was not power. It was not even revenge. It was identity. Violet Trent had built her very self upon a lie, and when Dorothy threatened to undo it, the lie had to be protected at any cost. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair that night, her knitting needles stilled in her lap. She felt not triumph, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. To live one's whole life as a careful mask, terrified of cracks showing, was its own kind of prison. Violet Trent was a victim too, not of others but of herself, of the unbearable weight of her own deception. And yet, sympathy could not excuse murder. Dorothy was gone, and Lucy had nearly joined her, all because Violet had chosen fear over honesty, control over compassion. The truth, terrible and tragic, was now clear. What remained was to bring it into the light, to let Violet Trent's hidden motive be revealed not in whispers, but in the plain sight of justice. Miss Marple folded, her hands, her mind already shaping the delicate trap. It would not be brute force that exposed Violet. It never was. It would be a small question, a slip of memory, a detail too fine for anyone but the guilty to reveal. And when it came, Miss Marple would be waiting. Miss Marple had waited for the right moment. Patience, she knew, was often the sharpest weapon in an investigation. Violet Trent had been careful, meticulous and cunning, but her fear had begun to betray her. Every missing saucer, every stolen bottle, every late-night visit had left a faint but telling trace. All that remained was to present a scenario in which the guilty would reveal herself, not through force but through her own compulsions. She arranged for a small gathering in her sitting room, inviting Lucy under the pretext of a friendly visit and coaxing Mrs. Trent to attend for tea. The vicar and Inspector Graves were given more formal reasons, discussion of the ongoing investigation, or so they thought. In reality, Miss Marple had set the stage, and the scene was already charged with subtle tension. The tea was laid, as Dorothy's had been, with a fine selection of china. Miss Marple placed the chipped saucer carefully among the other cups, its imperfection obvious but innocuous to anyone else. The room smelled faintly of baking and tea leaves, but beneath the cozy atmosphere ran a current of anticipation. Miss Marple poured the tea herself, her movements deliberately slow, her eyes meeting Mrs. Trent's across the table with the mildest scrutiny. "I do hope no one minds," she said softly, "that I've used this particular cup today. It's a little chipped, you see. But I've always felt the old pieces have stories to tell." Violet's hands trembled imperceptibly as she reached for her cup. Her eyes flicked to the chipped saucer, and for the briefest instant, color drained from her cheeks. Miss Marple's gaze, calm and patient, did not leave her. Lucy, seated nearby, said nothing, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her awareness. She was the unwitting catalyst Miss Marple had counted on. Her knowledge, however vague, kept Violet on edge. Miss Marple continued in her quiet, unhurried way. "You know, it is curious how some accidents seem so ordinary at the time. A cup, knocked, a bottle misplaced. Yet when one looks back, one notices patterns, repetition, familiar habits that reappear, almost as though someone meant them to." Violet's fingers tightened on the handle of her teacup. She set it down abruptly, the porcelain clinking against the table. I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice pitched too high, trembling. "Oh, but I think you do," Miss Marple replied, knitting her brows in that particular way that seemed innocuous, but carried the weight of subtle scrutiny. Little details are so easily overlooked, yet they speak louder than words. A misplaced bottle, a vanished note, a chipped saucer. One might think it mere chance, but one might also think otherwise. Mrs. Trent's lips pressed together, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. Miss Marple continued, unmoved by the display of composure cracking around her. "And yet, some people notice, don't they? They remember faint words spoken in passing, half-whispers, gestures that betray too much. One might even say that children notice, though they understand little. They remember everything, storing it away until it can be used. Are you familiar with that, Mrs. Trent?" Violet's eyes widened, and for the first time she looked genuinely terrified. She rose abruptly from her chair, knocking the teacup against the edge of the table. Tea sloshed over the surface, yet she did not pause to clean it. "You don't understand. Her voice cracked and she glanced toward the door as if contemplating flight. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, soothing almost, though every word was edged with purpose. I understand perfectly. I understand fear, the fear of past misdeeds coming to light, the terror of what one has done finally being seen clearly. But running serves no one, not you, and certainly not the truth. It is always better, I find, to speak plainly. Violet's hands trembled, and she sank back into her chair, her mask of composure gone. Her eyes darted toward Lucy, toward the inspector, and finally rested on Miss Marple, the quiet orchestrator of this revelation. It wasn't meant to go that far, she whispered, a shudder passing through her. Miss Marple nodded gently. I suspected as much. Fear drives people to extremes, but it is always the same fear. Exposure, imperfection, the breaking of carefully maintained order. You did what you did to protect yourself from the consequences of a past shared, a secret known only to you and Dorothy. And now that secret has reached the light, as all secrets do. Tears welled in Violet's eyes, and she finally spoke the words that had been buried under decades of careful civility and cold calculation. I helped her husband years ago. I did it because she wanted it, and I was afraid if she spoke, if anyone ever knew, it would destroy me. I never meant for Dorothy to die. I only wanted to protect what we had shared, the secret. But when she threatened to, oh, I can't, her voice broke entirely, and she buried her face in her hands. The room was silent, but for her quiet sobs. Inspector Graves, mouth open in astonishment, looked toward Miss Marple. She simply shook her head, as if to say that everything had fallen into its rightful place. Lucy exhaled a shaky breath and reached for Violet's hand, a gesture of fragile forgiveness. It's done now, she said softly. It's over. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together one last time as she rose to pour a fresh cup of tea. Sometimes, she said gently, it is the smallest details, the things we think insignificant, that reveal the truth. And sometimes even the deepest fear cannot withstand the quiet patience of observation. The tension ebbed from the room, leaving only the weight of revelation, the exposure of hidden motives, and the sense of justice, not entirely comfortable but undeniably complete. The final confrontation had not required violence nor coercion, nor dramatic confession under threat. It had required patience, insight, and the keen perception of the everyday patterns that even the cleverest criminal cannot fully disguise. Violet, Trent, shivering and exhausted, was led gently from the room by the inspector, no longer a figure of unassailable propriety, but a human being undone by her own choices. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting now idle, and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The case, tangled and treacherous as it had been, had at last revealed its hidden threads, and the truth had come to light in the calm, methodical way she had always known it would. Just as the village of St. Mary Mead began to breathe a collective sigh of relief, believing that Violet Trent's confession had closed the chapter on Dorothy Litton's death, Miss Marple felt a familiar stir of unease. It was a subtle feeling, almost imperceptible, a tiny thread that didn't quite fit the neat tapestry she had just woven. She had watched the room during Violet's breakdown, observed the careful avoidance of certain glances, and noted the way Lucy's eyes lingered not on the confessed guilty party, but on someone else entirely. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, knitting in hand while the village buzzed with gossip about the astonishing confession. Inspector Graves had begun filing the official statements and preparing to formally close the case. Lucy, now calmer, was visiting friends nearby to recover further from the shock of her near attack. Everything seemed to settle into the expected rhythm. Yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that something crucial remained unseen. She returned to the vicarage with the excuse of checking on Lucy, only to be met with a subtle but telling display. The vicar's wife, Jane, fidgeting, with a letter she had not meant to show, dropping it when Miss Marple entered. "Oh, I was just tidying," Jane said, cheeks pink. Retrieving the envelope with a visible tremor. Miss Marple picked it up carefully, noting the neat handwriting, the old-fashioned stationery. She opened it gently, reading the lines aloud in a low voice so that Jane could follow without strain. "The plan must proceed exactly as we discussed. Do not fail me again, or the consequences will be yours. Make sure the saucer is destroyed, and the arsenic bottle disappears. She cannot know the truth until the last moment." Miss Marple's heart gave a small, quiet thrum. The letter was not Violet's. It was addressed to her, in essence, the unseen orchestrator behind every disappearing piece of evidence, every staged accident, every calculated scare. Violet had confessed, yes, but she had not acted alone. Someone else had planned each desperate act, manipulating events so that Violet would appear guilty, while the true mind behind the crimes remained cloaked in shadow. She folded the letter carefully, her knitting needles clicking together, almost like a metronome keeping time with her racing thoughts. There was only one person who had had the access, the presence in all relevant moments, and the knowledge of both past and present secrets. The person who had orchestrated the theft of the arsenic, the destruction of the saucer, the forged notes, and even Lucy's fright, without ever leaving behind evidence that could immediately incriminate them. It was Mrs. Trent's long-time confidant and companion, Miss Millie Hawthorne, a woman who had served as Violet's quiet assistant, arranging tea parties, tending correspondence, and maintaining the house with the precision of a trained eye. Never noticed, never questioned, always in the background, the perfect shadow. Miss Marple realized that every movement, every small step to conceal truth, had been executed by Millie, not Violet. Millie had controlled the narrative, ensured Violet would take the blame, and manipulated the younger villagers into fearing the past. Miss Marple set about confirming her suspicion with subtle observation. That evening, she attended the tea that had been Violet's first step back into the public eye after her confession. Miss Millie moved among the guests with perfect calm, serving tea, adjusting chairs, smiling faintly. But Miss Marple noticed the micro-expressions, the quick glance at Violet as she fretted over the chipped saucer, the almost imperceptible tightening of her lips when Lucy mentioned the missing note. It was enough. Miss Marple devised a small test. She mentioned in the gentlest of tones that a small item had been found in the garden, an object that had vanished weeks ago, precisely the type of thing Millie had been careful to conceal. Violet visibly shivered, but Millie's reaction was instantaneous and telling. She turned pale, fumbled with her gloves, and muttered, How could that be?" The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple continued, stitching the trap with words rather than accusations. "Strange, isn't it?" she said softly. "How the smallest items, the quietest notes, can reveal truths we thought long buried. A chip in porcelain, a bottle of powder, a message lost, it all points somewhere, does it not?" Millie's composure snapped. She lurched forward, catching a tray to steady herself, and in that movement, the tension broke. "It was me!" she cried, voice trembling but firm. "It was I who moved the bottle, destroyed the cup. I did not kill Dorothy, I swear it, but I had to keep the others in line. Violet, poor Violet, she could not, she would have spoken and ruined everything. I thought I was protecting the family's reputation." The confession spilled out quickly after that, each revelation more damning than the last. Millie had orchestrated the thefts, arranged the threatening notes, and even engineered Lucy's fright, all to protect Violet and the shadow of secrets that had haunted the Trent household for decades. Inspector Graves, flabbergasted but grateful, immediately moved to take Millie into custody. Violet, meanwhile, sat quietly, finally understanding that her own confession, though sincere, had been manipulated to shield the true architect of the deception. Lucy clutched at Miss Marple's hand, relief flooding her expression. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, needles stilling, and allowed herself a faint smile. Once again, the truth had revealed itself, not through force, but by following the smallest hints, the subtle reactions, and the quiet inconsistencies that everyone else had overlooked. Even when the first confession seemed to close the case, the real story, always more complex than appearances, had awaited patient observation to emerge. The village would now speak in whispers of Millie Hawthorne, the quiet shadow behind every misdeed, and of Miss Marple's uncanny skill in unveiling the hidden threads that bound the past to the present. Justice had arrived at last, though only after one final twist reminded all that in matters of human deceit, nothing is ever as simple as it first appears. The village of St. Mary Mead had not yet fully absorbed the shock of Millie Hawthorne's confession when Inspector Graves began the formal procedures. Arrests were made, statements recorded, and the stolen arsenic, the shattered saucer, and the forged notes were catalogued as key evidence. Violet Trent, though cleared of the direct acts of sabotage, remained implicated in the psychological chain that had led to Dorothy Litton's death, yet she was no longer seen as the true villain. Millie Hawthorne, the quiet, ever-present companion, had been the mastermind behind the manipulation, and now she faced the consequences of her cunning. But as Miss Marple walked the familiar lanes of the village that afternoon, she sensed the subtle tremor that comes when justice has been served, yet something remains unresolved. The villagers, still murmuring among themselves, spoke of closure and relief, but Miss Marple noticed the small details that others overlooked. The lingering fear in Lucy's eyes, Violet's haunted expression as she pondered her own complicity, even the way the once bustling teacups now sat uneasily on polished tables, reminders of events that had left a mark far beyond the visible. She invited Inspector Graves to her sitting room for tea, as was often their habit at the conclusion of a case. The kettle hissed softly, the china clinked under careful hands, and Miss Marple began, in her gentle, unassuming way, to recount the series of clues that had led them through the labyrinth of deception. "You see, Inspector," she said, pouring tea with measured precision, "the missing arsenic was more than an obstacle. It was a signal. Someone wished to steer suspicion elsewhere. The saucer, destroyed at just the right moment, was another, a way to prevent a small but telling piece of evidence from revealing itself. And the false notes, carefully placed, were the final brushstrokes in a canvas designed to mislead, to frame Violet Trent, while protecting the true architect." Graves nodded slowly, listening as Miss Marple continued. Most people would have assumed Violet acted alone, that her fear and pride were enough to drive her, yet the subtleties betrayed a hand operating behind the scenes, the careful timing of each theft, the precise knowledge of what each act would conceal, the ability to anticipate human reactions. Only someone with constant, almost invisible access could execute such a plan. She reached for the letter Jane had accidentally revealed, holding it up as proof. Here the writing itself gave away the author. Only Millie Hawthorne could command that level of foresight, directing events while remaining in plain sight, and even Violet's reaction during the final tea confirmed it. Her unease was genuine, but her fear of exposure was manufactured by someone else. Inspector Graves leaned back, shaking his head in admiration. "Remarkable," he murmured. "I suppose we all missed it because we were looking for the obvious villain." Yet the one who remained quiet was the one controlling everything. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, Inspector. People often overlook the quiet ones, the observers who keep their heads low. They are invisible until they choose to act or are forced into it. That is why one must always attend to the small, seemingly insignificant details. A glance, a hesitation, a tremor in the hands. These speak volumes if you know how to listen." She paused, letting the words sink in. And yet, despite the resolution, one must admit the human heart remains complex. Violet Trent, though not the orchestrator, carries her own burden of fear and complicity. Lucy, though safe, will not forget the terror she endured. And Millie Hawthorne, brilliant in her manipulations, now faces the full weight of the law. Justice has been served, but not without leaving scars and questions about the consequences of secrets kept too long. The inspector nodded, glancing out the window at the village bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sun. "It is unsettling, though, isn't it? Even when the criminal is caught, the ripples of their actions linger. Lives are altered, and some wounds never truly heal." Miss Marple's knitting lay idle in her lap, her gaze calm and reflective. "Yes, Inspector, and that is why one must act with patience, observation, and care. The truth may be buried beneath layers of deceit, but it cannot remain hidden forever. And even when justice is delivered, one must remember that the consequences of human action often stretch far beyond what the eye can see." She rose and walked to the window, looking down the lane toward the cottages where the villagers had already begun to restore their routines. Children's laughter floated faintly on the breeze, mingling with the distant clatter of teacups being set for evening tea. The village would move on, yet the memory of the events, the poison, the threats, the vanished evidence, would linger in the corners of quiet minds. Miss Marple turned back to the inspector. The lesson, Inspector, is always the same. Observe carefully, trust your intuition, and attend to the details others dismiss. The answers are often in plain sight. One only needs the patience and attention to recognize them. Justice may be served, but it is the careful threading of observation and understanding that ensures it is the right justice. Inspector Graves raised his cup in silent acknowledgement, the two of them sharing a moment of quiet satisfaction. The case of the murder at the tea party had reached its conclusion, with the mastermind revealed and the tangled web of motives untangled. Yet Miss Marple, as always, knew that human nature would continue to conceal secrets, that deception could arise in the most unexpected forms, and that the quiet, careful eye must never rest, for there would always be another puzzle waiting to be solved. The village of St. Mary Mead had witnessed the full revelation of truth, the delivery of justice, and the unraveling of a long-hidden web of fear, pride, and secrecy. And Miss Marple, composed and quietly triumphant, returned to her knitting, content in the knowledge that patience, observation, and a keen understanding of human nature had once again ensured that justice prevail. The village of St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its gentle rhythms. The lanes that had been filled with whispers of fear and speculation now echoed with the soft shuffle of boots on gravel and the occasional peal of children's laughter. Tea was poured with less apprehension, and the shutters that had been closed against imagined threats were opened once more to the afternoon sun. Yet beneath this surface of normalcy, Miss Marple could still feel the faint pulse of unsettled secrets, the subtle tension that lingered like a shadow at the edges of the day. She walked along the familiar lanes, her knitting tucked into her bag, her eyes observing the minutiae that most villagers overlooked. The case of Dorothy Litton's murder and the subsequent web of deception had been laid bare. Violet Trent had confessed her part. Millie Hawthorne had been unmasked as the true manipulator, and Lucy was safe. Yet Miss Marple knew that human nature rarely produces neat endings. People forget details, suppress memories, and let small truths slip into shadow. Passing the vicarage, she noticed a faint disturbance on the garden path, a small footprint pressed into the damp soil. Not unusual in itself, except that it did not match the children who often played nearby. She crouched, examining it closely. The print was light, careful, deliberate, and yet its path suggested someone had lingered, almost as if they had been watching the house, waiting. A shadow of unease crossed her mind, and she straightened with that familiar quiet determination. Someone somewhere was still observing. Miss Marple continued her walk past the Trent household. The front door was open for the first time in weeks, and sunlight fell across the polished floor. She noted, almost absent-mindedly, that a single teacup had been left on the sideboard, its glaze reflecting a thin line of dust. The chipped saucer, once so crucial, had been replaced by a perfect one, but the slight tilt of the cup betrayed a hand unfamiliar with the careful habits of the household. Her mind turned over the details once more. Every pattern had its exception. Every confession, no matter how complete, left a trace of ambiguity. The missing note, the subtle reactions, even the way Lucy had hesitated in recalling the night of her attack, they all hinted at the possibility that something still lay hidden. Perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps it was a small thread that could unravel an entirely new story. Crossing the village square, Miss Marple paused by the market stall where Mrs. Price was arranging apples. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Price," she said lightly. "And how goes the village after all this excitement?" Mrs. Price gave a thin smile, busying herself with the apples. "Quieter, I suppose, but there are still whispers, Miss Marple. Even after everything, people seem to think the village holds more secrets than we see." Miss Marple nodded, a slight smile of agreement on her lips. "Indeed, my dear. Secrets have a way of lingering. Sometimes they hide in plain sight, and sometimes they wait for someone perceptive enough to notice. She straightened, feeling the air of calm yet charged anticipation that always accompanied the quiet moments before a new mystery revealed itself. As she continued toward her cottage, she reflected on the recent events. Justice had been served in the obvious sense, yet the nuances, the small inconsistencies, the footprints, the tilt of a teacup, the hesitant glance of a villager, reminded her that human behavior rarely offers complete closure. One might close a case, but the human heart remained complex, full of impulses, fears, and motivations that rarely aligned neatly. Reaching her gate, she paused to watch the sun dip behind the hills. Shadows stretched across the lanes, intertwining with the fading light, and in that moment she sensed the subtle promise of future intrigue. A cryptic whisper, a misplaced letter, a quiet observation. These were all potential sparks of the mysteries yet to unfold. Miss Marple knew the village would seem calm, yet beneath the surface, the currents of curiosity, secrecy, and human folly would continue to flow. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, placing her bag and knitting gently on the side table. Sitting in her favorite armchair, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The threads of the Tea Party murder had been unraveled, yet she felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. Another puzzle, another secret, was always waiting for those patient enough to notice. Picking up her knitting, she resumed her quiet work, the rhythm soothing yet alert. Her mind replayed every glance, every whispered word, every pattern that had led to the revelation of truth. The village appeared calm, but she knew better. Somewhere hidden in the ordinary lay the seeds of the next mystery. The familiar feeling of intrigue, delicate and insistent, tickled the edges of her consciousness. A faint knock at the door startled her, and she rose slowly to answer. On the doorstep lay a small envelope without a name, no indication of the sender. She picked it up carefully, noting the precise folds and neat handwriting, too deliberate to be random. Inside was a single card with a cryptic message: "The past is never truly gone. Watch closely and you will see what others try to hide." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, a quiet smile curving her lips. The case of the Tea Party was concluded, yet this simple card reminded her that mysteries were never truly over. They only awaited the keen eye, the patient mind, and the understanding heart that could perceive the truths others failed to see. Sitting back in her chair, she resumed her knitting, the familiar click of needles filling the room. The village of St. Mary Mead lay peaceful outside, yet she knew it was only a matter of time before another subtle thread would appear, another secret would stir, and the quiet detective would be called once more to untangle the web of human folly. The mystery had ended, yet in the very essence of observation, curiosity, and insight, she understood that a mystery never truly ends. And so in the soft glow of evening, Miss Marple waited, content and alert, ready for the next puzzle to reveal itself, knowing that while one chapter had closed, the story of human intrigue would continue as endlessly as the quiet rhythm of the village itself, even when the path had seemed impossibly twisted.